He had it all: a billion-dollar tech empire, a stunning new girlfriend, and a future so bright it cast a shadow over his past. Dining at Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, Ethan Hayes felt untouchable, but a single glance across the room shattered his perfect world. There she was, Chloe, his ex-wife, the woman he hadn't seen in a year. She was wearing a simple waitress uniform, her face etched with a familiar weariness. But it wasn't her job that made the air leave his lungs. It was the undeniable, impossible swell of her belly. She was pregnant. And as his mind reeled, trying to make sense of the timeline, a cold, terrifying thought struck him. He thought he knew everything about their breakup. He was wrong. The real shock was yet to come. The restaurant was called Veranda, a name that whispered of old money and new celebrity. It was a cathedral of modern cuisine, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a god's-eye view of Central Park. Each table was an island of soft light, the clinking of Cristofoli silverware against Bernardo porcelain, the only percussion to a low hum of powerful conversations. For Ethan Hayes, this was just another Tuesday. He sat opposite Isabella Rossi, a woman who seemed sculpted from sunlight and ambition. A successful fashion influencer, she wore a crimson dress that clung to her like a second skin, her laughter a carefully curated melody. She was the perfect accessory to his life, a testament to his success. "Darling, you haven't heard a word I've said," Isabella chided, her voice a playful pout. She tapped a perfectly manicured nail on her champagne flute. "I was telling you about the Milan trip. Donatella herself wants to meet." Ethan forced a smile, his mind pulling itself back from a spreadsheet of quarterly earnings. "That's incredible, Izzy. Truly. We'll celebrate." He raised his own glass, the crystal cool against his skin. He was 34 years old and the CEO of Nexus Dynamics, a software company that had revolutionized data security. He had a penthouse on Park Avenue, a garage full of cars he barely drove, and a life designed to be envied. He had everything he had ever worked for. His gaze drifted from Isabella, sweeping across the opulent room. It was a habit, a constant scan for competitors, for investors, for opportunities. But his eyes didn't land on a rival CEO or a venture capitalist. They landed on a ghost. She was clearing a table near the service entrance, her back to him. But he knew that posture, the slight curve of her spine, the way she tucked a stray strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. Then she turned, and the breath caught in his throat. Chloe, his ex-wife. She wore the standard veranda uniform, a crisp black shirt, black trousers, and a simple apron. It was a world away from the designer dresses he'd once bought her, dresses she wore to galas on his arm, her smile always a little strained under the bright lights. Her face was thinner, etched with a tiredness he recognized from the final, agonizing months of their marriage. But there was a softness there too, a quiet resilience that had always been her core. And then he saw it. It wasn't immediately obvious, hidden by the loose-fitting uniform and the way she held the heavy tray. But as she pivoted toward the kitchen, the soft light of the dining room caught her in profile. There was no mistaking it, a prominent, rounded belly that spoke of late-stage pregnancy. Ethan felt the world tilt on its axis. The muted chatter of the restaurant faded into a deafening roar in his ears. Pregnant. Chloe was pregnant. His mind, usually so sharp and analytical, became a maelstrom of confusion. "Ethan, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Isabella's voice cut through the fog, laced with a new edge of concern, or perhaps irritation. He couldn't tear his eyes away. Chloe disappeared through the swinging kitchen doors. He stared at the spot where she had been, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. I'm fine," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "Just thought I saw someone I knew." Isabella followed his gaze to the empty space near the kitchen. Her eyes narrowed. "Someone you knew? Or someone you'd rather I not know about?" She was sharp, Isabella. She hadn't gotten where she was by being oblivious. Ethan ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his composure, the one thing he prided himself on, cracking. He tried to do the math. They had finalized the divorce just over a year ago. 12, nearly 13 months. He looked back at where she'd stood, trying to gauge the size of her bump from memory. 7 months? 8? It was impossible. The word echoed in his mind, cold and absolute. Impossible. Because Ethan Hayes, the man who could build empires and bend markets to his will, carried a secret, a deep, unshakable failure that had been the silent third party in his marriage. A failure he and Chloe had discovered in a sterile doctor's office 3 years ago. The words zero motility and severe male factor infertility branding themselves onto his soul. They had tried everything. The expensive clinics, the grueling rounds of IVF. The hope that dwindled with each negative test until it was just a bitter residue of what they'd once shared. That failure had been the poison that killed their marriage. He couldn't give her the one thing she truly wanted, a family. In his shame, he had thrown himself into his work, building Nexus Dynamics into an impenetrable fortress to hide his own brokenness. He had given her wealth, a beautiful home, a life of luxury, but it was all just compensation, a gilded cage to distract from the one empty room in their sprawling apartment they never talked about, the nursery that would never be filled. So, how could she be pregnant? The question wasn't just a question, it was an accusation, a betrayal that felt like a physical blow. Had she been with someone else? Before they had even separated? The thought was a venomous serpent coiling in his gut. Chloe, his gentle, steadfast Chloe. Could she have been capable of such a profound deception? "Ethan, talk to me," Isabella insisted, her voice firm now. "You're pale. Who was that woman?" He finally looked at her, but his eyes were vacant, seeing only the ghost of his past and the impossible child she carried. "It's nothing," he lied, the words tasting like ash. "Just a migraine coming on. Do you mind if we call it a night?" He needed to get out of there. He needed to breathe. He needed to find her. The carefully constructed world of Ethan Hayes, the millionaire visionary, was crumbling, and all it took was a single glance at a pregnant waitress who was supposed to be nothing more than a memory. The shock wasn't just that she was pregnant. The shock was that it meant everything he believed about their end, about her, was a lie, and he was about to discover just how deep that lie went. Ethan barely remembered paying the bill or making his excuses to Isabella. His apologies were a clumsy string of words about a sudden investor crisis, a lie she accepted with a thin, skeptical smile. He knew there would be a price to pay for this later, a cold shoulder, a barrage of accusatory texts. But he couldn't care. His entire being was focused on one thing, the swinging doors to the veranda's kitchen. He told Isabella he'd get his own car and ushered her into the awaiting town car, shutting the door on her questioning eyes. The moment it pulled away from the curb, he turned, his expensive Italian loafers moving with a purpose they hadn't had all evening. He didn't go back into the restaurant. Instead, he found a shadowed alcove across the street, the late-night chill of the New York air doing nothing to cool the fever in his blood. He waited. For how long, he didn't know. Time had become a fluid, meaningless concept. Each minute stretched into an eternity, filled with a torturous slideshow of memories. Chloe, laughing on their honeymoon in Santorini. Chloe, holding a single, tiny baby shoe at a friend's shower, her eyes full of a wistful sadness he'd chosen to ignore. Chloe, her face pale and strained after another failed IVF treatment, telling him, "It's okay, E, we have each other." He had failed her. He knew that, but he had always believed their grief was a shared one, their tragedy a bond, even as it tore them apart. The idea that she had sought solace in another man's arms, it didn't just hurt, it desecrated the memory of what they'd had. Just as he was about to give up, convinced he'd imagined the whole thing, the service door creaked open. A few kitchen staff emerged, laughing and lighting cigarettes. And then, there she was. Chloe walked out into the damp night air, pulling a simple worn cardigan around her shoulders. The city lights cast a halo around her, and without the professional mask she wore inside, the exhaustion on her face was profound. She rested a hand on her lower back, a gesture so intrinsically maternal it sent another jolt through Ethan's system. He stepped out of the shadows. "Chloe!" His voice sounded foreign, a harsh intrusion into the quiet street. She flinched, her head snapping up. Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with a wary defensiveness. She clutched her worn leather handbag to her chest, a flimsy shield against the man who was once her entire world. "Ethan," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "what are you doing here?" "I saw you inside," he said, taking a step closer. The streetlights illuminated the full curve of her stomach. There was no hiding it now. It was real. I had to talk to you." A light drizzle began to fall, speckling the shoulders of his $1,000 suit. Chloe didn't seem to notice. "There's nothing to talk about, Ethan. We said everything a year ago." "Did we?" His voice was raw. "Did we really say everything? Because I feel like there was a rather significant omission," he just stated vaguely, helplessly, towards her midsection. Chloe's gaze dropped. She wrapped her arms around her belly in a protective embrace. The gesture was instinctual, and it pierced Ethan more than any angry words could have. "This has nothing to do with you," she stated, her voice losing its steadiness, a tremor of emotion running through it. "Nothing to do with me?" he repeated, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Chloe, look at me. We were married for 7 years. We tried for a baby for 3 of them. We went through hell. And now, a year after we split, you're pregnant. You can't stand there and tell me it has nothing to do with me." The rain was coming down harder now, plastering his hair to his forehead. Chloe just stood there, letting the rain fall on her, as if she deserved the cold. "Please, just go," she whispered. "You're with someone else. You have your life. Let me have mine." "I can't," he said, his voice cracking. The question that had been screaming in his mind finally broke free. "I have to know. Is it mine?" For the first time, a flicker of genuine anger ignited in her eyes. It was a fire he hadn't seen in years. "Are you insane?" she shot back, her voice rising. "How could you even ask me that? How dare you?" "How?" he practically shouted, taking another step until he was only a few feet from her. "Because the timeline makes no sense. Unless you were seeing someone before we—" "Stop!" she cut him off, her voice like ice. "Don't you dare finish that sentence. Don't you dare try to paint me as the villain in a story you destroyed." The raw pain in her voice silenced him. He saw then that this wasn't the righteous anger of someone caught in a lie. It was the deep, wounded cry of someone who had been hurt beyond measure. She looked at him, and the anger in her eyes dissolved into a profound, heartbreaking sadness. "You know it can't be yours, Ethan," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, heavy with the weight of their shared history. "You, of all people, know that." And with that, she turned and walked away, her steps quickening as she disappeared into the rainy darkness, leaving him standing alone on the slick pavement. Her words hung in the air, echoing the sterile, clipped tones of Dr. Albright. A near-zero chance of natural conception, a biological impossibility. He knew it couldn't be his, logically, medically, and yet his heart, his gut, screamed otherwise. He stumbled back to his car, the rain soaking through his suit, his mind a chaotic whirl. He drove on autopilot, the gleaming skyscrapers of the city blurring into streaks of indifferent light. He ended up not at his pristine Park Avenue penthouse, but at his office. The headquarters of Nexus Dynamics was a sleek glass tower, silent and empty at this hour. He walked through the deserted floors, the only sound the soft tap of his shoes on the polished concrete. He stood before the massive window in his corner office. The same view as the restaurant, but from higher up. He was king of the city, a master of his universe, but he felt utterly powerless. Chloe's words replayed in his mind. "You know it can't be yours." She wasn't admitting to an affair. She was stating a fact they had both been forced to accept years ago. So if it wasn't his, and if she wasn't the type to have a casual, meaningless fling, then who was the father? It had to be someone significant, someone she trusted, someone who had been there for her when he wasn't. A new, colder dread began to creep in, far worse than the suspicion of a simple affair. His mind started sifting through their circle of friends, the people who had known them as a couple, who had taken her side in the divorce, who had called to check in on her. And then one name surfaced from the murky depths of his paranoia, a name that made his blood run cold. Mark Dawson, his best friend, his business partner, the co-founder of Nexus Dynamics, the man who had been the best man at his wedding, Mark, who had always had a soft spot for Chloe, Mark, who had told him he was a fool for letting her go, Mark, who had mentioned just last week that he'd helped Chloe move some furniture into her new apartment. The thought was vile, a betrayal of such epic proportions it seemed impossible. But in the landscape of the impossible that his night had become, it felt terrifyingly plausible. He had lost his wife because he couldn't give her a child. Had his best friend stepped in to give her both? The shock of seeing Chloe pregnant was nothing compared to the sickening, terrifying possibility that was now taking root in his soul. The next 48 hours were a waking nightmare. Ethan moved through his life like a phantom, his body attending meetings and answering emails while his mind was trapped in a labyrinth of suspicion. Isabella's calls went to voicemail, her increasingly frantic texts left unread. The world he had built, with its clean lines and predictable outcomes, had been contaminated by a single, intractable variable: Chloe's pregnancy. He couldn't shake the image of Mark's face from his mind. Mark Dawson was everything Ethan wasn't, or at least everything he had ceased to be. Where Ethan was driven and intense, Mark was calm and empathetic. He was the COO of Nexus Dynamics, the steady hand that managed the day-to-day operations, while Ethan chased the next big innovation. They were a perfect team, two sides of the same coin, or so he had thought. Now every past interaction was re-examined through a new poisoned lens. Mark's gentle defense of Chloe during their divorce. "She's a good person, Ethan. She just needed more from you," no longer sounded like friendly advice. It sounded like a confession. The way Mark would sometimes look at Chloe at company parties, a look Ethan had once dismissed as brotherly affection, now seemed like longing. He started digging. He was a man who dealt in data, and he would use data to find the truth. He bypassed his own company's notoriously tough security protocols he himself had designed, and accessed Mark's corporate email and calendar. It felt like a profound violation, a line he never thought he'd cross, but the gnawing uncertainty was worse than any guilt. He scrolled through months of correspondence, his heart pounding with each click. He found nothing incriminating: emails about server upgrades, budget forecasts, HR issues. But then he searched for Chloe's name. There were a handful of emails. They were innocuous on the surface. "Hey, hope you're settling in okay. Let me know if that leaky faucet is still giving you trouble. Just wanted to forward you this job opening at a friend's marketing firm. Seemed right up your alley. Happy birthday, Chloe. Hope you have a wonderful day." Ethan's hands tightened into fists. To an outsider, it was kindness. To Ethan, it was a secret correspondence, a hidden intimacy. Leaky faucet? Job opening? Mark was weaving himself into the fabric of her new life, a life from which Ethan had been surgically excised. The final piece of his self-constructed puzzle clicked into place when he checked Mark's calendar archives. He went back 9 months. His eyes scanned the entries: board meeting, investor call, dentist. And then he saw it. An entry from a Thursday afternoon, simply marked, "Personal appointment, CPW, Central Park West." The address was only a few blocks from the fertility clinic they had used, Dr. Albright's clinic. It was circumstantial. It was insane. But for Ethan, it was proof. A tidal wave of rage and betrayal crashed over him, so potent it made him physically sick. He stumbled to the private bathroom in his office and retched, the bitterness in his throat a pale imitation of the bitterness in his soul. He couldn't wait. He couldn't sit on this. He stormed out of his office, past his startled assistant, and strode towards Mark's office at the other end of the floor. He didn't knock. He threw the glass door open with such force that it slammed against the wall, startling Mark, who was on the phone. Mark looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "Ethan! What the—" He quickly ended his call. "I'll call you back," he said, his gaze fixed on Ethan's thunderous expression. "What's wrong? You look like hell." "I know," Ethan snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He stalked towards the desk, planting his hands firmly on its polished surface and leaning in, invading Mark's space. "I know about you and Chloe." Mark's expression shifted from surprise to utter confusion. "What are you talking about? You and Chloe? There is no you and Chloe. Don't play dumb with me. Ethan's voice boomed through the office, a raw, wounded sound. I saw her, Mark. She's pregnant. The confusion on Mark's face was replaced by a flash of something else. Was it pity? Sadness? He sighed, running a hand over his face. Okay, yeah, I know. I ran into her a few weeks ago. You ran into her? Ethan scoffed. Is that what you call it? Or was it during one of your personal appointments near Central Park West? Helping her with her leaky faucet? Mark stood up, his affable demeanor gone, replaced by a steely defensiveness. You've been spying on me? You went through my emails? After 10 years of partnership, of friendship? That's what you do? Friendship? Ethan laughed, a harsh, broken sound. Friends don't sleep with their best friend's ex-wife. Friends don't father a child with her behind my back. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Mark stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief and hurt. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment in his eyes. You're a fool, Ethan, he said, his voice quiet but sharp as a razor. You're a brilliant, paranoid, self-absorbed fool. Is that a denial? Ethan challenged, his body thrumming with adrenaline. Of course it's a denial, Mark shouted, his own control finally snapping. God, I can't believe I even have to say this. I would never, ever do that to you, or to Chloe. I love her like a sister. I always have. I was helping her because her husband, my best friend, buried himself in work and left her completely alone. I was trying to be the friend you stopped being. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, but his suspicion was a fortress. The baby, Mark. Whose baby is it? Mark's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by that same infuriating pity. He looked away towards the window, as if gathering his thoughts. It's not my place to say, Ethan. It's her story to tell. So you do know, Ethan pounced on the admission. I know what she's been through, Mark corrected him, his voice tired. I know how much pain you caused her, pain you were too busy counting your money to even notice. He turned back, his gaze locking with Ethan's. You want to lead? You want something to obsess over? Fine. Stop thinking about me. Stop thinking about some imaginary affair. Instead, try to remember the last few weeks before she left. Try to remember what she was fighting for, what you were so quick to dismiss. He paused, letting the words sink in. Think about that last appointment at the clinic, Ethan. The one you barely showed up for. The one you called a waste of time. With that, Mark sat back down in his chair, turning pointedly to his computer, the conversation over. Ethan stood frozen in the middle of the room. The last appointment, the words echoed in the sudden silence. He had a vague, hazy memory of it. Chloe had been talking about some new procedure, some experimental long shot. He'd been in the middle of a hostile takeover bid for a rival company, working 20-hour days. He remembered being on the phone in the waiting room, annoyed at the interruption. He'd signed a consent form she'd pushed in front of him without even reading it, his mind on closing the deal. He'd dismissed it all as another desperate, futile attempt, another failure. Think about that last appointment. A new kind of dread, colder and more terrifying than betrayal, began to seep into his veins. It wasn't the scent of betrayal he had been chasing. It was the stench of his own colossal, unforgivable negligence. He turned and walked out of Mark's office, not in a rage, but in a daze. He had been so certain of her guilt, of Mark's betrayal, but what if the traitor, the real villain of the story, had been him all along? The drive back to his penthouse was a blur. Mark's words, think about that last appointment, were a relentless drumbeat against the inside of his skull. The city lights, usually a symbol of his triumph, now seemed to mock him, illuminating a path of profound personal failure. He had built an empire of data, of absolute certainties, yet his own life was a black hole of ignorance. He bypassed the grand living area, with its sterile white furniture and art gallery coldness, and went straight to his home office. This was his sanctum, a room where the world could be controlled, ordered, and understood through screens and code. But tonight, the order felt like a lie. He powered up his personal laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He started with his digital archives, a meticulously organized cloud storage system that held every document from the last decade. He searched for Dr. Albright's name, for the clinic's name, for IVF. He was flooded with files, invoices for astronomical sums, clinical summaries filled with dispiriting jargon, email chains with nurses. It was a digital monument to their failure. He filtered the results by date, scrolling back to the tumultuous weeks before Chloe had moved out. He remembered the arguments, the long silences, the feeling of two people drifting apart in the same space. He had seen it as the natural end, the final exhausted collapse of a relationship that had run its course. He'd never once considered that for her. It might have been something else entirely. And then he found it. It was an email from Chloe, sent 13 months ago. The subject line was simple. One last try. His heart stopped. He clicked it open. I know you're busy, but I need you to read this. Dr. Albright called. There's a new procedure they're having success with in Europe. It's called IMSI, intracytoplasmic morphologically selected sperm injection. It's a long shot, even more so for us, but she says it bypasses some of the issues we've had. It's a much higher magnification selection process. They have a trial slot open next week. I know what you're going to say, that we should just stop, that it's more money and more heartbreak. But Ethan, I can't close this door without knowing we tried everything. Everything. Please, just this one last time. I've attached the consent forms. We both need to sign. Chloe. He stared at the words and a cold sweat broke out on his brow. He remembered the email now. He had skimmed it between frantic calls about the Nexus takeover. He had seen long shot and trial, and his cynical, exhausted mind had translated it to false hope and waste of money. He remembered her approaching him that evening, her face anxious and hopeful, holding out the forms on a clipboard. He had been on a conference call, pacing the living room. He had waved her off, then, irritated, had grabbed the pen, scrawled his signature on the line she pointed to without breaking stride and handed it back, his attention already back on the call. He hadn't even looked at her. He clicked open the attached PDF. There it was, the consent form for the IMSA procedure. And at the bottom, two signatures, hers neat and hopeful, and his, a rushed, jagged slash of ink. A signature given without thought, without care, without an ounce of the love that had started their journey. The date on the form was exactly 13 months ago. The procedure would have taken place a week later. A standard pregnancy is 40 weeks. Just over 9 months. If it had worked, if that 1 in a million shot had actually hit its mark, the timeline was perfect. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the air punched out of his lungs. The room seemed to spin. It wasn't Mark's baby. It wasn't some stranger's baby. It was his and Chloe's, a miracle child, conceived from a ghost of a chance he had dismissed and forgotten. The shock was a physical force, a white-hot wave that washed through him, incinerating his anger, his suspicion, his self-righteous indignation, leaving behind only the cold, heavy ash of shame. He hadn't been betrayed. He had been forgotten, and he deserved it. He thought of Chloe, going through that procedure alone. He had probably been in a boardroom, celebrating his corporate victory, while she was in a sterile clinic, holding on to one last shred of hope for the family he had given up on. He thought of her, getting the news. Was she alone? Who did she tell? Not him. Why would she? He had already shown her in 1,000 different ways that he was no longer a partner. He was an obstacle, an emotional absentee. He thought of her going through the first trimester, sick and scared, while he was on a yacht with Isabella, celebrating his new life. He thought of her, feeling the first kick, buying the first baby clothes, setting up a nursery in some small, lonely apartment. She had done it all without him. She had protected their child not from a stranger, but from its own father, from his world of relentless pressure, of conditional love, of success that was measured in stock points instead of shared moments. He finally understood the look in her eyes when he'd confronted her in the rain. It wasn't the anger of a liar. It was the deep, weary pain of a woman who had been forced to carry the greatest joy of her life as a secret, because the man who should have been by her side had made it clear he was no longer there. He looked around his office at the awards on the shelf, the framed magazine covers with his face on them. Innovator of the Year. The man who secured the future? It was all a joke. He was a fraud. He had secured data and lost his soul. He had built an empire of glass and steel on a foundation of his own broken promises. The shock of seeing her pregnant was nothing. The shock of suspecting his best friend was nothing. The real shock, the one that brought him to his knees in his silent, empty office, was the devastating, undeniable truth. He had been given the one thing in the world he thought he could never have, and he had been too blind, too arrogant, and too broken to even notice. He hadn't just lost his wife. He had abandoned his child before it was even born. The sun had not yet breached the horizon, but the artificial twilight of New York City painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and faded gray. For Ethan Hayes, the darkness was internal, a suffocating void that had consumed him whole. Sleep had been an impossibility. The night had been a torturous pilgrimage through the ruins of his own making. He had paced the vast, sterile expanse of his penthouse living room, the polished marble cool beneath his bare feet. Each object seemed to mock him. The abstract painting he'd bought for $250,000 felt meaningless, a splash of color signifying nothing. The sleek, minimalist furniture, chosen for its aesthetic perfection, offered no comfort. It was a showroom, not a home. A mausoleum for a life he had mistaken for success. At one point, in a surge of self-loathing so potent it felt like acid in his veins, he had seized an angular crystal award from his shelf, Global Innovator of the Year, and hurled it against a concrete support pillar. It didn't shatter into 1,000 pieces as he'd expected. It simply cracked with a dull thud and fell to the floor, flawed and broken, just like him. The metaphor was so crude, so obvious, that a dry, humorless sob escaped his lips. His mind, a relentless engine of analysis, had replayed the last 13 months with excruciating clarity. While he was closing the RedSec acquisition, the deal that cemented his legacy, Chloe was undergoing a deeply personal and physically demanding medical procedure. The day he had popped champagne with his board, celebrating a victory of commerce and ego, was likely the very day their microscopic, miraculous child had been conceived. While he was posing for magazine covers, a new life was taking root. While he was jetting off to St. Bart's with Isabella, a woman who represented the spoils of his new life, Chloe was likely battling morning sickness, alone. The shame was a physical entity, a leaden weight in his gut. He had been so wrapped up in the narrative of his own perceived failure, his infertility, that he had used it as a shield, an excuse to become emotionally impenetrable. He had weaponized his shame to justify his ambition, telling himself he was building an empire because it was the only thing he could build. The truth he now saw was far uglier. He had simply chosen the easier path. It was easier to conquer boardrooms than to confront the intimate, terrifying vulnerability of trying to build a family. He pulled out an old tablet, one he hadn't used in years, and scrolled through photos from before Dr. Albright, before the hollowed-out feeling, pictures of him and Chloe in their 20s, goofy and in love, hiking in upstate New York, their arms slung around each other. A photo of her painting the walls of their first tiny apartment, a smudge of blue on her nose, her laughter so radiant it seemed to emanate from the screen. This was the woman he had won, and this was the woman he had systematically dismantled with his neglect. By the time the first true rays of dawn pierced the floor-to-ceiling windows, a decision had solidified. The old Ethan would have called his lawyers. He would have strategized, planned a hostile takeover of the situation, demanding paternity tests and visitation rights, using his immense resources to bulldoze his way back into a life he had forfeited. But the old Ethan was a ghost, a cautionary tale. The man standing in the wreckage of his living room knew that power and money were not the tools for this. They were the very poison that had caused the sickness. This required a different kind of currency, humility. He showered and dressed, deliberately ignoring the rows of bespoke suits that hung like a silent, judging army in his closet. He pulled on a pair of worn jeans he hadn't touched in years and a simple, soft gray cashmere sweater. He looked in the mirror and saw not a CEO, but just a man. A tired, broken man of 34 with the weight of 1,000 regrets in his eyes. He took a nondescript sedan from the lower level of his garage, a car the doorman rarely saw, and merged into the early morning traffic. The drive from his glittering Manhattan spire to the residential heart of Queens was a journey through different worlds. He left behind the cold ambition of Midtown, crossed the bridge, and entered a realm of brick buildings, bodegas, and tree-lined streets where life felt grounded, real. It was Chloe's world now. He found the address, a pre-war building with a certain quiet dignity. He parked the car and stood on the opposite sidewalk for a long time, just watching. A mother pushed a stroller past. A man walked his dog, the smell of bacon wafted from an open window. This was life in all its simple, unglamorous reality. The life Chloe had chosen. The life she had built to protect their child from him. Finally, he crossed the street and entered the small, tiled lobby. His eyes found the tenant directory. There it was, typed on a small slip of paper, slid into a brass slot. 3B, C. Miller, not Hayes. The finality of that name, the public declaration of their severance, was a small, sharp pain in his chest. His hand trembled as he raised it to the intercom, his thumb hovering over the button for what felt like an eternity. He was terrified. She had every right to tell him to go to hell. He deserved it. Taking a ragged breath, he pressed the button. A moment of static, then her voice, cautious and thick with sleep. "Hello? Chloe," he said, his own voice hoarse, foreign. "It's Ethan." The silence that followed was immense. It stretched for so long that he thought the connection was broken, or that she had simply walked away. He could hear the faint, tinny sound of a morning news program from her apartment, a murmur of a world that was continuing on without him. He was about to turn and leave, to accept this silent rejection as his penance, when the speaker crackled again. "What do you want, Ethan?" Her voice was flat, a shield against any possible hurt. "I need to talk to you," he pleaded, the word need feeling more true than any word he'd ever spoken. "Please, just for 5 minutes. I'm not here to argue or demand anything. I just need to say something. I'll leave right after, I swear it." He waited, his entire future seeming to hang in the balance of her decision. Then a sharp, jarring buzz echoed in the small lobby. The lock on the main door had been released. He pushed it open and took the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs with each step. Her apartment door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. He nudged it open and stepped inside. The warmth of the place enveloped him instantly. It smelled of lemon polish, old books, and cinnamon. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes as they danced lazily in the air. It wasn't decorated so much as it was lived in. A worn, comfortable armchair was draped with a colorful, hand-knitted blanket. Books were stacked on every available surface, and framed photos of friends and family smiled from a side table. It was a home, vibrant and real in a way his penthouse could never be. His gaze was immediately drawn to a corner of the living room. There, partially assembled, stood a small white crib. A hex key and a sheet of cryptic instructions lay on the floor beside it, and on the wall above it, she had painted a beautiful, tender mural, a soft, silver crescent moon surrounded by a gentle cascade of stars. A lump formed in his throat. Chloe stood by the window, her back to him, a silhouette against the bright morning light. She held her arms protectively around her belly, clad in a simple, comfortable-looking maternity dress. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I know," he whispered, his eyes locked on the crib. He took a few hesitant steps into the room, stopping in the center, giving her a wide berth. The carefully rehearsed apologies evaporated from his mind, leaving only the raw, unvarnished truth. "I went back to the office," he began, his voice raspy with emotion. "I found everything. The email you sent, the one about the IMSI procedure, the consent forms." He took a shaky breath. "I remember it now, Chloe. I remember it all. I was on a conference call, pacing the living room like a caged animal, furious about some detail in the RedSec contract. I remember you approaching me, your face so full of hope, and I waved you away. I signed my name on that line without even reading the words, without even looking at your face. My signature was just another task to be completed so I could get back to what I thought was important." He paused, the shame of the memory threatening to choke him. "I closed that deal. I was lauded as a genius. And I didn't even have the decency to be present for the single most important moment of our lives. I didn't just dismiss the procedure, Chloe. I dismissed you. I dismissed us. A small, choked sound escaped her throat. She finally turned to face him, her beautiful face pale, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, a fortress of pain and resilience. Why? He asked, the question not an accusation, but a desperate, broken plea. When you got the news, the good news, why didn't you tell me? Tell you, she shot back, a tremor of long-suppressed anger in her voice. Tell the man who called our last hope a waste of time? Tell the man who was on the cover of Forbes, grinning like he'd conquered the world? When, Ethan? Should I have called you in St. Bart's? I saw the pictures online. You and her. You looked so happy, so unburdened. What was I supposed to do? Send a text? Hey, remember that miracle baby you never thought you could have? Well, he's on his way. Hope you and the model are enjoying the beach. Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, and he let them hit him. He deserved every ounce of her fury. I was scared, she confessed, her anger deflating into a whisper of raw vulnerability. I was terrified, because I knew you. I knew what would happen. You would have taken over. It wouldn't have been our joy. It would have been your new project. You would have hired the best doctors, the best nutritionists, the best neonatal specialists. You would have bought a new, bigger apartment, designed the perfect nursery. This child, our baby, would have become another acquisition, another asset to be managed and perfected. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let our child grow up feeling like an accessory to your ambition. I couldn't let them feel the way you made me feel. Invisible. He had no defense. It was the truth. It was exactly what he would have done. He took another slow step towards her, his hands open at his sides in a gesture of surrender. You're right, he said, his voice finally breaking, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. Everything you're saying is the God's honest truth. I was a coward. I was a terrible husband. I hid my own insecurities behind a wall of money and work, and I let you wither on the other side. I broke us, not our infertility, me, and I am so profoundly sorry. The word sorry feels like an insult. It's so small compared to the damage I've done. He looked at her, at the incredible strength holding her together. I'm not here to ask for you back, he said, his voice raw with sincerity. I don't deserve you. I lost the right to be your husband a long, long time ago. But please, Chloe, please don't let my failure as a husband make me a failure as a father before I even have a chance. Let me be a part of this child's life, on your terms, any terms. If you want me to send a check every month and disappear, I'll do it. If you want me to see him for 1 hour on his birthday, I'll take it. Whatever you say. I'm letting go of all control. I want to know my child. Tears were now streaming silently down Chloe's face. She looked at this new version of Ethan, stripped bare of his arrogance, his pride ground to dust. She saw the boy she had fallen in love with, peering out from behind the eyes of the man who had shattered her heart. She didn't speak. Instead, she closed the small gap between them. She took his hand, a hand that had signed billion-dollar deals, but was now trembling like a leaf, and she guided it gently to the firm, round curve of her belly. His fingers splayed across the warm fabric of her dress. The world seemed to stop, and then he felt it, a distinct, powerful, undeniable flutter from within, a roll, a push, a kick. It was a shock wave of pure life, a jolt that bypassed his brain and went straight to his soul. It was a biological truth, a paradigm shift that happened in a single breathtaking second. His eyes, wide with awe, shot from her belly to her face. A real, actual sound of wonder escaped his lips. For the first time, a small, watery, but genuine smile touched Chloe's lips. Her own tears still flowed, but they were different now. He does that, she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He gets active when he hears your voice. And so, a story that began with the shock of a supposed betrayal ended with the profound shock of self-realization. Ethan Hayes, a man who thought he had conquered the world, discovered he had abandoned his own heart. He learned that true failure isn't losing a deal. It's failing to be present for the people who matter most. Their story is far from over. Trust is not rebuilt in a day, and the scars of the past don't simply fade. Can a man who so thoroughly broke his family ever truly piece it back together? Can he become the father his child deserves and the partner Chloe needed all along? That chapter is yet to be written. What would you do in their shoes? We want to hear your thoughts. If this story of heartbreak, loss, and the fragile hope of a new beginning moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with a friend who appreciates powerful, true-to-life drama. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the complexities of the human heart. Let us know in the comments below. Do you think Ethan and Chloe have a future? We can't wait to read what you think.